So we've set the industrial context of what's going on in Hollywood through the 1940s up to the breakdown of the Hollywood studio system and the post-war era that starts at the end of the 1940s and the 1950s. And this is a time for the industry where they're really struggling and having to compete with television, and tremendous changes going on in the movie industry having to do with the breakup of their monopolies where they control production, distribution, and exhibition. And basically, this all leads to some different ways of making films more economically and also offsetting risk and making movies with riskier content because the production code is less and less enforced, and you need to have content that's more risque in order to appeal to audiences. Now, cultural context, other things that are going on outside of just the entertainment industrial complex. The 1950s is an era of increased social mobility, lots of it having to do with the GI Bill. So the middle class booms and grows after the Second World War, owing in large part to the GI Bill, which puts more and more veterans through college and allows them also to buy homes. And those things expand the middle class, and that means lots more social mobility. And with social mobility comes social anxieties about how do I act now that I'm entering new spheres of social interaction, new kinds of class mobility, and so on. It's also an era of increased social consciousness, particularly in the realm of civil rights. The civil rights movement we often think about happening in the 60s, but really it's the 1950s that have the big impact on shaping the civil rights movement. And the key legislative victories happen in the 60s, but it's the 50s where there's really a broad growing sense around there have to be changes made in our society. And a lot of that has to do with African American veterans coming back from having been in Europe and having experienced different standards of equality, and then coming to the United States and being limited in their own country that they fought for in ways like where can they get loans to buy houses, where can they go to college, and the differences in what they have access to and what they're allowed to do really being put in their face. So, increased social consciousness. At the same time, there are other kinds of pressures socially to conform. For example, the 50s is an era of a lot of conformity in terms of what the suburbs look like, what you should aspire to if you want to be a part of the middle class, what your kinds of consumer habits should be, what you should seek to buy, how you should dress, the kind of cars you should have, things like this, a lot of which becomes visible through popular media and advertising. Another area of conformity that isn't just about buying things or where you live has to do with gender roles. So there is a lot of attention and increased visibility around models of masculinity and models of femininity. That is, what are men supposed to be like? What are women supposed to be like? And really what you see in the 50s is an emphasis on more traditional and rigid gender roles than had existed in the 40s and earlier, particularly in the 1920s, when there was a real sense of modernization of culture. In the 50s, there's emphasis on more rigid gender roles, women, instead of working, going back, taking care of the house, being in the household, and men being the ones who are working. And with those kinds of social pressures, a couple of the other sort of cliches or concerns that emerge have to do with, on the one hand, the idea of the organization man. The organization man was the man who's so much a part of the organization that he works for that his whole personality is defined through it. His sense of success and what he should be and how he should behave are all determined by the organization. This was something that sociologists diagnosed and wrote about, and bestsellers about this topic existed. Another in terms of women was the idea of momism. And momism was a popular psychological prescription for what was wrong with men in the 1950s, particularly young ones, juvenile delinquents. They like to blame it on mom. Mom being overbearing, leading to their sons possibly being gay or juvenile delinquents. There is a trend towards blaming women for the ills of culture too. So the thing about the 1950s and all these different things going on is that we also have just an exploding popular culture, not just in film and television, but also print magazines. In the 1950s, whoops, that did not give me the bullet. Excuse me for a second. There it is. That's the bullet point I wanted you to see. The 1950s gives the world both Playboy and Mad magazines. All right, and we might think of these as being very different. If you know, you're probably aware of both these things, but Playboy was a men's magazine that featured nude pictures of women, which actually were just a small part of the magazine. It also had lots of articles about movies and fashion and music. It was really a whole guide about how to be a man, but not how to be a married man or a father, how to be a bachelor, or at least pretend that you were a bachelor. And then there was Mad Magazine, on the other hand, which was outrageous comedy in print, lots of parody of movies and comic books and TV shows. In other words, a comic outlet for all the pressures that were going on throughout the culture and all the cultural changes. And Playboy, in a different way, was a kind of outlet too. On the one hand, you have nude photographs, but you also have the opportunity to consume, and a model of one way of living in the world that actually isn't a traditional gender role. It's not about being the father and being the provider and being the husband. Playboy is about promoting a lifestyle of consumption and being a single man, and overwhelmingly a fantasy world, right? Where the vast majority of people who subscribe to Playboy magazine or read Playboy magazine, they actually were not living that lifestyle. They were probably married, they probably had kids, or they certainly weren't as successful as the model that the magazine proposed. Anyway, my point here is that these are two different examples of popular culture serving as a kind of escape valve for all these social pressures that are going on in the 50s. If we think again about that model of Freud and where laughter comes from, it comes from social anxieties having to do with repressions of sexual desire or behavior or just anger even in some way. Now, that brings us to our movie that we're watching, Some Like It Hot. And I'm just going to talk a little bit here about this film and how we approach thinking about it. So this is obviously a comedy. What kind of comedy it is? Well, it's a lot of different kind of comedies. It's a black and white movie. It comes out in 1959. Many movies in 1959 were not black and white. This could have been a color film. Making it in black and white is a deliberate decision on the part of the filmmakers. And one key reason is that it harkens back to screwball comedy, the kind of movies that we were just talking about. Those things like Philadelphia Story, as well as other earlier movies from the 1930s. So as you recall, in the screwball comedy, our romantic leads are eccentric compared to the others that surround them, that are more normal. And there's a really speedy language that has lots of jokes crammed into it. And there are also double entendres. You can't say overtly the kind of sexual comments that you want, so you say something else that contains some kind of sexual reference within it. That's a double entendre. And that's what you have to do to get away with the restrictions from the code. So in 1959, the code is not as in effect in the same way. But those kinds of restrictions allow us another way of making both popular mass entertainment that can be promoted, as well as playing with those repressions of what you want to say but you can't say, and comedy allows that to come out. Other aspects that you see in this film, there is a heavy dose of that anarchistic style of comedy of the Marx Brothers. If you watch the trailer, you'll see they even mention there hasn't been a movie like this since the Marx Brothers. We have slapstick comedy, physical comedy, nonstop action, lots of quick one-liners, just like the Marx Brothers, although not to that same degree. There's still a dose of that style, that approach to comic mayhem that we saw with the Marx Brothers. There's also an aspect of parody. We have not really talked about parody that extensively yet, except to talk about how some things like the Eric Andre show kind of bend our expectations of what a form is supposed to be like. But in this film, we see a kind of parody of 1930s gangster movies. That's just one among many things that it does. You'll see it's making references to the gangster genre, which really was very popular in the 1930s. Movies like Little Caesar and Scarface. So I hope you've already watched the trailer for Some Like It Hot. If you haven't, be sure and watch that after this lecture video. So you'll see how far they're willing to go to refer to these other kinds of comedies and other kinds of films, but also how they will foreground sexuality and sex appeal. Marilyn Monroe is in this movie after all. Just so you know, that trailer would never have been on TV. Movie trailers at this time were not commonly aired on TV as commercials, so people would have only seen that in movie theaters. Okay, so I want to go through quickly some background here on the film itself, Some Like It Hot. So this was produced by the Mirisch Company in conjunction with United Artists. So big trend in the post-war era of the 1950s is that studios don't want to fund movies themselves. That's too much of a financial risk. So they'll pair with an independent company that has to bring a lot of the money to the table. That's what we're seeing with Some Like It Hot. It was directed and co-written by Billy Wilder, huge presence in Hollywood history, particularly in comedy, but not only comedy films, a very important writer and filmmaker. He, in fact, was from Austria, but he was a Jew and had to flee. He had a successful career in Germany before the war as a screenwriter in Berlin, but he had to flee the Nazis. He first went to Paris and then ended up in Hollywood in the early 30s, where he worked initially as a writer and actually won an Oscar in 1939 for a screenplay for Ninotchka, which was a romantic comedy, and I highly recommend you check out that film too. It's very funny. He didn't just do comedies, though. He directed Double Indemnity, which is a classic film noir in 1944. And then he won Best Director and Screenplay for a film, The Lost Weekend, which is a very heavy drama about alcoholism just right after that. In the 50s, he becomes more associated with comedies, though. One of my favorite films, Sunset Boulevard, he writes and directs, as well as Stalag 17, which is a comedy about a prisoner camp in Germany. It turned into, years later, the television show Hogan's Heroes, as well as 7 Year Itch, which was another comedy starring Marilyn Monroe. So this film, Some Like It Hot, comes out in 1959, and it's successful. It doesn't win a lot of awards, but immediately the year after, Billy Wilder wins Oscars for Best Producer, Best Director, Best Screenwriter for The Apartment, which is another comedy, and that also stars Jack Lemmon, actually, who we see in this film. Okay, so this film, one of the things that they did in order to get it made and make it a success is they put together a package not just of a successful writer and director, but of these stars. So we have Marilyn Monroe, who is very popular at this time. And initially her career, she very much is just portrayed as a pure sex symbol, blonde bombshell, airhead type character. But she stays at the Actors Studio and develops acting chops and does more serious, more roles with depth in them, up until her unfortunate death early in the 1960s. In this film, you're going to see her as a blonde bombshell again. However, there is depth to her performance and to her character, so be on the lookout for that. The other male actors in this film, Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon. Tony Curtis starts out just kind of like this very striking, good-looking guy, but he becomes a major dramatic star in the 1950s. Not as well known for comedies, more of a dramatic actor. However, you'll see in this, he has very very substantial comic talents of mimicry and impersonation. Keep an eye out for the impersonation of Cary Grant that he does. It's one of the all-time greats in film history. And then there's Jack Lemmon, who is also a dramatic and comic actor and very successful, very long career up until the 80s, and maybe, I'm not sure if he ended up dying in the early 90s, but he had successful films all the way up until things like Grumpy Old Men in the 1980s. Great character and actor as well. So, discussion. I'd like for you to think about this film in terms of how it plays with gender roles. I think it's a great example of a film. It comes out in 1959. This is the end of the 1950s. This is a decade of all kinds of repression having to do with how men are supposed to be, how women are supposed to be. It's set in a different time. It's set in the 1930s. But it's the kind of film that could never have existed in the 1930s. So that's not only the setting, but it's a way of rethinking about an era and playing around with gender roles. So my suggestion to you is a lot of the pleasures of this film and a lot of the comedy derives from breaking social prohibitions that have to do with gender norms and gender performance. This film is a lot about gender performance. And while in the film, it is explicit gender performance of men pretending to be women or particular kinds of women, keep in mind we're talking about a decade in which there have been lots of social pressures having to do with being the right kind of man, being the right kind of woman, and certainly pressures having to do with sexuality. Overt, this was not a time when people who were homosexual could be openly homosexual. It had to be hidden. It had to be repressed. It was not acceptable. You had to perform a certain kind of heterosexuality, even if you weren't heterosexuality. So, in this film, which is wild and wacky in lots of different ways, I think a lot of the pleasure still derives from being able to break those norms of social behavior. And I'd like for you to think about the different attitudes that you see in the film in terms of what it means to break those boundaries. And is it ultimately a good or bad thing for those people that break those rules? Do they pay for it or not? Because remember, that was part of the code. If you can break these rules, you can break what's supposedly the proper morality, but you better pay for it. In this film, not so sure you see that. Look at these characters and see, is it constructive or is it destructive for them to break these kinds of rules? Last thing I'll say is the individual you see here on the left, this is Joey Brown. He was a very popular and successful comic actor going back to the 1920s. And so he plays just kind of a minor character in this film. Important, not so minor maybe, but he's not one of the major characters anyway. So this is another opportunity for him at the end of the 50s to kind of appear again as a comic actor who's a maybe not so straight man.